Well, today we're going to talk about the state of Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley Index was just released by a joint venture. Contains a boatload of information about the economy and housing and people and jobs. We're going to focus probably most on housing and transportation, which continue to be the big issues for the Valley. And we're also going to dive into a survey that one of our editorial interns did on the middle class. And she wrote today's cover story on the meaning of middle class. We have a lot of data from Palo Altans on what their experience is and what they're struggling with in Palo Alto. So first to the index. I'd like to know what kind of surprised you guys about the index. As we know, the issues haven't changed much over the last couple of years. But what have you found in it? What was surprising to you?
I think the most amazing thing to me was, we all know that there's a great disparity in wealth and that housing prices are going up and there isn't enough housing to go around. Those are the obvious things. But the shift in the demographics and the percentage of people who are working in the Valley in the tech industry who are foreign born, I think was really pretty amazing. I think the number was something like 60-some-odd%. There was just an incredible number of people. And also, another trend that's happening is that the number of people who are leaving the Valley and moving, let's say, out of state or to other parts of the country, it's basically almost the equivalent to the number of foreign-born workers who are coming in. So we're just seeing a real shift.
Yeah, there's a real wholesale change in the demographics.
I thought it was interesting to the same point that 51% of the people in Silicon Valley speak another language at home now.
51%?
Yeah, it was 48% about a decade ago. So it's not like a huge change, 3%, but just the fact that more than half now, it's kind of also kind of goes along with what you said about the people becoming more diverse and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that really struck me is that most of the foreign-born women they're working in the STEM fields. However, women are getting something like a 40-some-odd% less pay, like 49% less pay than male counterparts, which is when we hear about income disparity. I had no idea it was that big of a gap. So that's another thing that was surprising.
Yeah, what shocked me was the commercial development because here in Palo Alto, there's been a lot of efforts to restrict that. There's like a new office cap and all that. But just looking at the index numbers for how much commercial growth, office growth was added in the last 3 years, 18 million square feet, more than prior 12 years combined.
Wow.
So even when we talk about housing prices, and we might get into a little later what Palo Alto is doing on this, but it just seems like that whole thing is dwarfed by the number of office development elsewhere in the region outside of Palo Alto. And it just kind of goes to show what the challenge is. And another kind of related stat that jumped out at me is that in Silicon Valley, we spent 66,000 wasted hours daily in our car trips. The commutes have the commute times have gone up by like 17% over the last decade, which is totally believable.
For those of us who are on the road.
Yeah, which is about 43 extra minutes of driving per week. Although wasted hours is a bit of an interesting term. It doesn't give those podcasts a lot of credit, but still, lots of offices, not much housing, much more commuting. It all goes together.
Well, I think the index lays out very well just the linkage between all of this commercial development, all the jobs that are being created, all the people who are coming in to the Valley because of the jobs. Either literally they're coming into the Valley by commuting, or they're trying to find housing here, which has driven up the prices. One thing that I found interesting was that the index said that the median home price in 2017 went up 7.4%, nearly $67,000. So if you didn't buy in 2016, you have to have an extra $70,000 plus interest.
It's more than double what the state is, right?
Yeah.
It's like more than twice what it is in California. Which is
and Palo Alto, let's dive into that for a minute. Palo Alto's median home price, according to the City of Palo Alto's housing work plan, which was just released, pegs that figure at $3 million. I think in our cover story we quoted 2.7 million is kind of the median sales price. But that is a fair share of people's income that's just going to the mortgages. And Fiona Kelleher, our editorial intern who did the survey in December and January on what does it mean to be middle class, to try to tease out, what people's experiences are. I mean, she was interviewing a lot of people who were just saying that they were barely keeping up. You know, a great percentage of their income was going to the mortgages. One person said, I wouldn't live in Palo Alto except I've paid off my house. You know, I bought it a long time ago. Other people are saying, you know, we are probably rich by some people's definitions, but we don't have a fancy lifestyle. We have one house, basic cars, no fancy vacations or extravagant purchases. And that respondent, their household income was $400,000 or more. So yeah, we're seeing wealth, but also struggle, even within that same class.
Yeah, and another thing that kind of struck me, I mean, it's something we've talked about in the local scene in Palo Alto, but just the changing demographics, the huge number, the huge growth in the senior population.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a 31% increase in residents over 65 over the last decade. So that seemed like quite a big number. And,
Yeah.
And which kind of also further emphasizes like the housing problem, because a lot of these people are on a fixed income. And so even though a huge part of the new index is that there's all this new wealth being created and, you know, how the economy is still booming, there's also kind of the flip side of the people on fixed income for whom the corresponding lack of affordability becomes a real problem.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that related to seniors as well is that something like 85, 86% of them are not planning on, they're going to stay in place, they're aging in place.
They are.
So those houses are not going to turn over very easily. So that's another aspect of this. And then you have compiled on that, the amount of housing, new housing that's being built is basically something like 79% of it, or 80 some odd percent of it, is basically being built for wealthy or, you know, high moderate income, above moderate income persons, which leaves something like 4 to 5% for everybody else, for every other class, economic class of people. So from very poor to even to moderate income, you're only getting like a 4 to 5% of build out for those people. So that really leaves a lot of people out.
So basically market rate at this point is pitched towards the higher income.
Yeah, and you have affordable housing complexes in Palo Alto where people spend years and years on the waiting list, which kind of, you know, it's illustrated in these numbers. Like, it's getting harder and harder to get affordable housing.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of the things that was brought out in the index as well is that the number of people, I think they said something like, even though you're seeing raises in the amount of income that people are making, I think they said the average median income was about $131,000, which leaves a lot of us out of that. But then if you go down, dig deeper behind that number, you find out that what moderate income in this valley is something like $55,000, and that doesn't go very far, and $28,000 if you are considered low income. So those figures don't go very far when you're, you know, bumping up against enormous rate increases in rents and housing. And even they're saying even like childcare jumps something like 31%.
Right.
So you've got a lot of pressures. They say something like 10% of people in the valley basically have trouble having enough food on the table, and they had to. Was it like over 300,000 meals were served or given to people in the valley, but just the valley. I'm not talking San Francisco. Just because people didn't have enough food.
Yeah.
So
you know, we speak to the poverty kind of in a certain age range, and I think a lot of people expect that by the time they get to the end of their careers, they should be pretty well off. There's one person in the survey that Fiona did who was earning more than $400,000 and, you know, categorized himself as rich and retired. But there was also someone who was 73 and said, I think of myself as middle class, but in this environment, I don't feel nearly as financially secure as I expected to be at my age of 73. This person was earning $75,000 to $99,000. So I think that there's, you know, the reality of being impoverished, you know, being hungry, but there's also a perception too that I don't have the security that I expected, and it's largely because of this environment, whether or not it's perceived because all my neighbors have Teslas, or because, you know, I expected it to go farther, my income to go farther in terms of sustaining me for, you know, the rest of my life.
Well, I think that's the thing is when people sit down and look at the dollars and cents of what they have in their bank accounts or their 401ks or, you know, any of their investments, or whether they even have any of that at all. I think that's where the numbers are coming up, and then they're thinking, you know, well, especially if you don't own a home, let's say, and you've got to rent. Now your rent is going up and up and up, and you know, if you're looking at retirement, how are you going to meet those goals? You know, how are you going? Any of your savings is just eroded away. So for that alone,
pushing the boulder uphill. I wanted to bring in, just to kind of broaden the discussion, bring in some of the figures that we compiled for what does middle class mean income-wise across the country. So in Palo Alto, middle class, which we took the Pew Research Center definition of being 2/3 to double the area median household income. So in Palo Alto, middle class ranges from about 92,000 to 275,000. If we looked at a comparable college town, for example, at the low end, Charlottesville, Virginia, which has about 47,000 people, their middle class low end is 33,000, and their high end is 101,000. So their high end is like just barely, you know, in the same region as our low end. And it goes across the board. You can see it in our cover story that middle class definitely means something different. Of course, we have higher incomes, but we also have higher cost of living that's, you know, causing people to feel struggling and like they're panicking, really.
Yeah, and it's a combination of the higher costs and what Fiona talked about in her story, the challenge of keeping up with the Joneses is getting harder and harder. Because there is the pressure of being surrounded by affluence, and even though you might be wealthy in absolute terms, in relative ones, you don't feel so wealthy. Because I think one of the quotes was, they have a Tesla SUV and we have a Tesla. It's like, okay, maybe the good people of Charlottesville making $33,000 and considering some middle class wouldn't get much sympathy. But I do think it is a reality. That's
yeah, for sure. I think there's just so many numbers and so much to digest that's one of the things about the index. And one of the things that I think you have to there's a caveat that I think is important to realize is that not all of the figures in the index relate to 2017 or even 2016 numbers, because some of the data that they've gathered is, you know, let's say it's only up to the, you know, 10 years, it's 10 years back, or it goes back to 2015 for some categories. So even when you're looking at those numbers, you have to wonder, well, in that 2-year span, a lot can happen. So are things going very high up? You know, are they increasing? Are they decreasing? We don't know. One of the things that we always hear about as a trend is, for example, rental housing. And we all know that's gone up. We've written stories about it. You know, we know people who have been displaced because of the high cost of rents. And about 15% of homeless people in the Valley are homeless because they were displaced. The majority of people who, I think it's something like 35%, are homeless because they lost their jobs. So even amongst all of the wealth that we have, you know, that something like that, some sort of catastrophic event, there's no wiggle room there. So, you know, the other thing too is that rents go up and up and up. However, they are declining. They have declined for the past 2 years. But that doesn't mean anything when you think about from 2011 till now. They've gone up something like 30-some-odd%. So, you know, it's still really, really inflated, even though you might say, well, it's going down a little bit. See, the trend seems to be a certain way, but it really isn't. The other thing that, you know, when you look at these indicators, for example, of something like commercial, you know, how strong is our economy here? And one of the indicators they look at is the vacancy rate, let's say, for commercial buildings. Well, the vacancy rate has gone up. So that is an indication of a slowdown. But you can't really say that.
It's an indication of huge growth in commercial.
That was my other point. You know, but when you see how many, I forget how many you quoted, about hundreds of thousands of square feet.
18 million.
18 million. Oh, okay. It's not even in thousands.
In the last 3 years.
So, okay. So when you're talking about 18 million square feet, then you've hit a certain saturation point, at least temporarily, till more people want to come in here, and another business starts up and starts expanding. But there's just a little bit of a lull from that. So, you know.
And I just want to say on the housing side, because of this commercial growth, I think one of the things that the joint venture report always kind of makes clear to me is the huge scope of the housing problem. Because one of the kind of more promising things I read in this thing is that the number of permits for new housing has actually gone up quite a bit last year. Like but I think in the first 11 months of 2017, there were more than double, like 2.4 times the number of permits issued than in 2016. So you think it's a good sign, but Silicon Valley-wide, like all the cities are still meeting just 18% of their regional allocations. So it almost seems like, I mean, I can't imagine how much you'd have to ramp up the housing permits to even meet like a decent share of what you need to provide to
we've dug
house all the
ourselves in a
workers.
hole, and now there's maybe more drops in the hole, but the hole is still largely empty.
Well, the other thing too is that while we are building more housing, most of that housing, once again, is going for people who are higher incomes, high, moderate, and high income. And, you know, we're talking double digits. We're talking, you know, 3/4 of the housing, let's say, is going to that demographic, whereas everybody else is in the single digits. And that, you know, it really shows that we haven't done the job that we say we're going to do. You know, I guess the developers don't really care about you know, their bottom line is to make money off their real estate, right? And so this is the way they're doing it. They're not, Redwood City, for example, isn't hardly build all this, you know, multi-unit housing, but most of it isn't for poor people. It isn't even for moderate people. It's for tech workers and people who have, you know, more income. So that's
let's talk about what the city of Palo Alto is doing, because it's kind of in a...
It's a good transition because it addresses, it exactly addresses what Sue just said, is that most of this housing is not affordable to low-income or even moderate-income people. And I think it's striking. I think for the first time since I started working here, I could actually say Palo Alto is moving fast on housing. I think in the last few weeks and in the week ahead, they're actually going to be creating new zoning districts. One for the missing middle, which the Planning Commission approved a week ago, which is people making 120 to 150% of area median income. And so that's kind of targeted for the project on El Camino and Page Mill micro units. And then and next week they're going to discuss a new zoning designation specifically for 100% affordable housing, BMR housing, so below market rate. And that's it's kind of centered around the proposal by Palo Alto Housing for El Camino and Wilton Court. But in both cases, they're setting these kind of new zoning precedents that could be applied to other sites and that could lead to housing developments that specifically address the need that Sue was just talking about, you know, the people who are not reached by the market rate housing that's being provided otherwise.
Yeah, and just to provide the context, I mean, this discussion about housing has been ongoing in Palo Alto, but they were waiting to finalize the update of the comp plan, which happened.
And we're seeing now the huge impact that happened because, you know, a lot of people say comp plan doesn't really matter, and it may or may not, depending on how you view it, but the fact remains that it freed up staff to do other stuff, and now we're seeing these new initiatives come out. And so these two new zoning districts, if they're approved by council, which they haven't been yet, you know, could significantly change Palo Alto's housing policies for many years to come, and if nothing else, could add to two concrete housing developments in the near term. So it's by Palo Alto standards, where housing generation has been, you know, moving at a snail's pace in the last 5-10 years. I think that's a pretty significant change from my perspective.
And what is Liz Niss wanting to do with one of the committees in terms of bringing a greater focus on housing? Yeah,
Liz Niss, the new mayor, I think she's emblematic of the shift because, you know, she's a huge housing advocate, and her top 3 priorities were housing, and more housing, as she said. And so basically the city council has 2 standing committees, and every once in a while the real committee. Policy and Services Committee kind of deals with all new legislation, kind of everything from surveillance ordinances to marijuana. And she's adding like new housing policies to their purviews, which means they're going to be, well, from what she said, they'll probably be meeting more often and kind of coming up with new ways to encourage housing. And the city council just this past week started talking about this housing work plan, which the discussion will continue next Monday, but that includes some of the policies that we're talking about here with the new districts, as well as dozens of others, you know, everything from increasing the number of inclusionary, you know, revising inclusionary zoning, which basically means that if you do go forward with market rate of the kind that Sue was talking about, you will have to provide some BMR, and just a bunch of other policies that could spur, you know, more housing construction.
Are they largely looking at entire housing developments as kind of a solution to providing this housing that Palo Alto sorely needs? Or are they thinking of sort of more infill, the granny unit idea?
I think it's all of the above. I think, you know, they always talk about Palo Alto being built out, which, I don't know, could be true depending on how you look at it. But infill is still everyone's preference, obviously. But that's not the sole that's not the sole objective. I mean, there's new rules about ADUs that both the state of California and Palo Alto recently revised. And Palo Alto's laws, in many ways, are meant to conform to the state's guidelines, but in some cases they exceed it. So, so the ADU ordinance is on the books, and it's still kind of being tweaked. Then in the next year, I think it's going to get really interesting. 2019, when they start talking about R1 zoning. According to this work plan, that's going to be a difficult discussion, I think.
Single-family homes.
Single-family homes are going
Neighborhoods.
to, talking about encouraging more duplexes and those kinds of developments that could kind of raise more housing, but outside of the commercial areas where we typically see multifamily developments.
Yeah. We can't leave the topic of Silicon Valley without talking about transportation. And I know the city of Palo Alto has also made some recent proposal to try to fight traffic through greater funding from developments. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they recently revised their what's called the traffic impact fee, that everyone thought it's referred to as TIF when you sit through these meetings. But it's not going to solve much. I mean, because it's just kind of almost a drop in the bucket when it comes to the size of the city's capital needs. But it is very emblematic of the Palo Alto's broader shift to kind of discourage trips and try to raise more money for initiatives that reduce traffic. And basically before, the city had a citywide fee of about $3,000 for every new trip that a development would have to generate. And they had like 3 other fees based on specific parts of the city. And basically this week, the Finance Committee agreed to basically scrap that system and basically have one citywide fee, which would be more than $8,000 per trip. So if you think your development's going to generate 100 trips, you could subtract the amount that you think you'd be able to get to switch from cars to other sources. But for the remainder, you'd have to pay $8,000 per trip. So that's kind of the new shift.
Well, currently, I guess in the Silicon Valley Index, they basically said that 73% of commuters are driving alone.
Yeah.
So that's a huge number of people, and they said that it's basically about 79% travel from San Francisco down to Silicon Valley, to Santa Clara County, and something like 89% go the other way. I don't know why there's a difference there, but there is.
Misery likes company. Great. but yeah, it's a huge statistic, and it kind of underscores how ambitious Palo Alto's plans are, because their goal is every new development has to get 50% of the people to take other means in downtown.
Yeah,
and
maybe more symbolic than the funding is the effort to get people to have TDM programs, transportation demand management programs, to get people to stop just driving altogether.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like there's been a big increase on mass transportation, but whether or not we still don't have anything really going east and west that much. There's been discussion about bringing back the Dumbarton Rail. East Palo Alto has talked about, why don't we have some sort of big parking areas, so when people get over here, they park their cars and they take a shuttle. Samtrans has been looking at and is now talking, meeting with public stakeholders to try to figure out ways to develop a more robust transportation bus system, shuttle system. So those are the main problems are those east-west connections, but you also have north and south, where you've got, I think it was something like VTA had a 31% bump in their ridership, and Caltrain 45%. So it's clear that people they would like to take mass transit, but we need to have we have the problem of the connections that we've discussed many, many times.
Yeah, I found one of the factoids in the index interesting, which was that the shuttles that go from companies to different neighborhoods around the Bay Area is the 7th largest fleet. 7th largest, not public, but transportation system.
That's what happens when you have red tape. And then look at BRT.
Yeah, I was going to say
the other lesson.
They basically have created their own transportation system.
Yeah.
Mass transit system.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, there's a lot of data in the Silicon Valley Index. If people want to read it themselves, they should go to jointventure.org. I'll put in a plug for our middle class cover story. There's a digital version online at paloaltoonline.atavist.com. There's charts, there's photos, there's quotes. You can read all about that there. So thanks for the discussion. We will see you next week. We're always on paloaltoonline.com If you want to talk about this topic, go to paloaltoonline.com/square for Town Square, our community discussion forum. And if you like the webcasts and want to subscribe, do that below. And always, we ask you to like us. We'll see you next week.